Never take advice from somebody who hasn't already done what you want to do. Anyone can move their fingers and sound okay, but fewer can use their ears. Early on, B.B. King was everything to me. He was like the president of my musical country. And there's an interview where B.B. said something to the effect of that he thought if he ever heard it as good as it sounded in his mind, he'd quit. The great lesson in that is that he was hearing things in his mind. The internet loves to point the finger at old men shouting at the sky. But if Paul Simon said it 35 years ago, was he an old man shouting at the sky then? Songwriters on Songwriting, Paul Zollo, between 1990 and 93, he conducted the interviews with Paul Simon. Do you think we'll hunger for melody again? Simon says, it's possible, but I don't think so. People will forget about melody, and they won't hunger for it. They won't know what it is. Maybe from old records or CDs? Simon says, well, that's what would have to happen. But you know, people don't read history. People don't listen. Some do, most don't. When we take this generation now and go a generation past this, they won't be listening before that. It took me a long time to listen to music that existed before rock and roll. A long time. And the people who were born years later, even they can't seem to go back beyond the 60s. They don't listen to the 50s rock and roll, which had its own melodies. I really liked that kind of melody. But you're closer to the age of melody, because the big band era and post-war, that was still all about melody. The days of Irving Berlin and those great songwriters was about melody. Nobody's come close to writing melodies like they did. Nobody. Pause. Maybe Paul McCartney. He's the one you'd choose? I think he's probably the most notable melody writer. Stevie Wonder also. And then he asks, how about yourself? Not in the same league with Paul McCartney. But I still have a memory of melody, so I do write melody. But I think he has a really, really great gift. He didn't study, but he's very, very musical. He thinks clearly about it. He thinks about the shape of it. Yeah, I heard him describe music in terms of where he understood the shape. He plays a few instruments, and his ear is really fine. All art is imagination, and that cannot be fixed. If you can hear things and shape them and craft them, well, then you're a musician. Very few people really care about great guitar players. The general public buys the records, or did buy the records at one point in time. If improvisation is simply spontaneous composition, well, then all you need to do in order to play a solo is to quote the melody, or at least use it as a springboard, and you don't even have to be that good at guitar. 5th grade, I hear Come As You Are coming off of a boombox in the school library. What does he play for the solo? The melody, which will be the only time in the history of humans documented on video for the rest of time, where someone has segued from Kurt Cobain back to Chet Atkins. There's an old story about Chet Atkins, where somebody was on a session with Chet, and the guitar player said, Chet, I don't know what to play here. And Chet said, well, the melody usually works. Go back and listen to Chet's solo on Liza from the album Fingerstyle Guitar. How does that single note solo begin? He quotes the melody. That was in 1956. Liza. It was an old Gershwin tune and one of the classic Chet Atkins arrangements. Meanwhile, in a musical life before I got to Chet Atkins, which was a pretty long time, relatively speaking, about 5 years, what was I obsessed with? Well, I was certainly listening to a lot of Eric Clapton. Well, what does Eric play during the solo to Sunshine of Your Love? He quotes the melody to Blue Moon. Sometimes a quote of the melody is literal, and other times it's a little bit more disguised. Sometimes it might be following the general contour and the general rhythm and feel and idea and feeling of the melody, more than a specific melodic quotation of it. But I think of an example of like Jimi Hendrix, that beautiful solo he plays, all on the 2nd string, during his solo to Waterfall, also known as May This Be Love. What does Bruce Springsteen play in the solo to Badlands? Well, he basically quotes that vocal melody that he set up earlier on in the previous verses. There's not much to it. Walter Becker and Donald Fagen were not about to call Bruce Springsteen when Larry Carlton couldn't make the session. But that's the point. Anyone can do it. George Harrison might be one of my favorite guitar players of all time. What is the solo to Nowhere Man? Well, it begins pretty similar to the Lennon vocal melody, with that opening interval, it's a 4th, and then George deviates from the melody just a little bit, and then towards the end of the solo goes back to what's pretty much a direct quotation of the ending of the vocal melody. A more dramatic example of just quoting the melody altogether would be the solo on And I Love Her. And later on in the solo career, you can hear beautiful melodic things he played, like on Somewhere Else, which was a beautiful tune on the album Cloud 9. George Harrison, one of the great melodic guitar players ever. Then there was the time that Tom Petty wrote Breakdown, and Mike Campbell pretty much just played a blues solo for about 6 minutes, as he says. And then later on that night, or more like very early the next morning, Mike Campbell gets a call from Tom, who's still in the studio, saying, "You got to get back over here. You played something right at the end, and that's the hook." So even if you're not quoting an existing melody, make a melody out of something. Other examples that would come to mind for me would include Let Me Love You on the Jeff Beck Truth LP, Jeff Beck and Rod Stewart. The first solo is a little bit less literal. Beck's not really quoting the melody per se, as much as the phrasing and the feel of it to my ears. But later on, there's a guitar vocal interplay where Jeff pretty much does play the melody and then Rod answers. That all goes back to the Delta. It all goes back to Charlie Patton, predating Robert Johnson. Patton would do things where he'd sing a line and then instead of finishing the vocal line, he'd answer it with the guitar. It's no surprise then that when you listen to the great guitar players, it's a great tradition. Listen to what Duane Allman plays on the solo to I Am Yours, which was a chorus on Derek and the Dominos, Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs. Duane pretty much just plays the melody. Circling back to Chet Atkins, the tune To Be or Not to Be. He quotes the melody first and then develops the rest of his solo outward from that. I didn't want to play any guitar for you in this video because if I did, then you'd just be parroting what I played and copying my hand positions. There's no point in doing that when you can use the greatest asset you already have, your own ears. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again next time.